Hello everyone, that music is Les Cyclopes by Jean-Philippe Rameau, performed by Paul Barton and published by Feuerich. And this is Sam of Historiansplaining. A historian tells you why everything you know is wrong. These lectures are on SoundCloud, Spotify, YouTube, and other platforms. And if you can help to keep them coming, please go to my Patreon page. The link is in the description. And this lecture is Doorways in Time, the Great Archaeological Discoveries, Part 9, Troy. The discovery of the remains of ancient Troy is really different from all the other previous discoveries I've talked about in this series. For one thing, it's an extremely complex and multi-layered story, both literally and figuratively. It's also a very controversial story with a lot of uncertainty and even outright lies and deceit. I expect I'll probably break it into two parts. I think I'll record one on how the remains of Troy were located, uncovered, excavated, how this feat was accomplished. And then I think a part two on how it's been interpreted. What can we actually know about this deeply ancient Bronze Age city and the civilization that it was part of, based on what has been found there. But this is the first discovery I've talked about thus far where the discoverer actually set out specifically to find it. And this is unusual. In previous discoveries I've talked about in earlier lectures, the archaeologists or excavators picked a site, usually a hill or a mound, where they expected that there might be something archaeologically significant, but they didn't know what it was or what they would find until they excavated and uncovered it. And that's the case in Sutton Hoo, in the library of Ashurbanipal, Göbekli Tepe, and in a different way with the early audio recordings, right? People knew that they existed for many years. It just took time till they could be analyzed and recovered. Or in other cases, some totally ordinary person, like a shepherd or a farmer, just by chance came across something that turned out to be enormously historically important. And that's the case with the Nag Hammadi Library and the Gnostic Gospels, the Terracotta Army in China, the Antikythera mechanism and the shipwreck where it was found, and the Dead Sea Scrolls, which was the subject of the last lecture in the series, which I've posted on Patreon for patrons. So this sort of a subject that I'm talking about with Troy is new in that the discoverers already knew precisely what they were looking for. Troy is a city that looms very large in the Western imagination and has for millennia. A legendary, splendorous, powerful city that was consigned by fate to destruction. And it served as an archetype for the tragic nature of history, and also a symbol for the honorable enemy, whose tragic flaws lead him to downfall and doom, despite all of his higher virtues. A kind of classical tragic hero writ large, you could say. And the excavators who went looking for Troy knew a bit about the city. Not only characters and incidents from ancient epics and legends, but also clues and details about the language and customs, the buildings, the layout, the fabric of the city. And as for the location, the main source about Troy is, of course, Homer's epic, the Iliad, which is a long narrative poem describing one part of the legendary Trojan War. This is a war in which a gathered force of Achaeans, basically from the southern part of Greece, and other fighters from other parts of the Aegean, set sail east across the sea, where they landed, besieged, then sacked and burned the city of Troy, which also in the ancient legends is called Ilion or Ilios, hence the title of Homer's epic, the Iliad. And the poem is traditionally attributed from ancient times to a legendary poet called Homer, who lived in the 700s BC. And today, most scholars believe that more likely it was really the cumulative work of many bards working in an ongoing oral tradition over centuries. But putting that debate aside, regardless, either way, whether there was one single author called Homer or if it was the cumulative work of a long tradition, either way the Iliad describes characters, incidents, and settings of the war, and hence it is very tempting to see it as a historical source. But the canonical text of the Iliad that we can see today was only written down in the late 700s BC, and the events that it describes took place in the early 1100s BC. In other words, more than 400 years before this text that we know was composed. And no written sources at all survive from those centuries in between. And hence there's no telling how much the story may have been changed, embellished, or just made up out of whole cloth. And furthermore, even if one takes the Iliad seriously as a historical source, it only covers one part, a period of about a few months during the last year of the Trojan War, which was allegedly a 10-year-long war. And it's lacking a great deal of context. The Iliad doesn't tell the story of how the war started, which allegedly is because a Trojan prince named Paris either seduced or kidnapped a queen of Sparta and carried her off to Troy. Nor does the Iliad tell how the war ends, with the Achaeans sneaking into the city in the Trojan horse. And these episodes are not in the Iliad, but they have to be gleaned and gathered from brief references or summaries in other ancient Greek texts. So as for the Iliad itself, it basically just covers the height of the war, with several pivotal close-fought battles and several dramatic one-on-one duels. It gives a very sketchy description of the location of Troy. It apparently was somewhere on the eastern side of the Aegean, on the top of a broad hill at the end of a long, low ridge. The inner citadel of the city, with its palace and temples, is atop a somewhat higher, steeper hill. Behind the city to the east is a high, rugged plateau with streams and rivers flowing down from it. And the other direction in front of the city, the gates look out onto a broad plain. Running through this plain is a winding river, which Homer calls the Scamander, and the river flows down through the plain and empties into the sea. From the city's lookout tower, one can see out to the sea and beyond to the islands of Limnos and Samothraki. And this is an important clue, because the fact that it's within sight of these islands indicates that the site of Troy is on the northeastern Aegean Sea, presumably then not too far from the mouth of the Dardanelles, the narrow sea channel that connects the Aegean Sea to the Black Sea. And hence it stands to reason that perhaps the site of Troy was in the northwestern corner of Anatolia, the landmass that the ancient Greeks called Asia Minor. Today it's part of Turkey. But regardless, Troy must have been somewhere in northwestern Anatolia, just below the mouth of the Dardanelles, where there is in fact a high plateau, traditionally called Mount Ida. And then sloping down to the west from that plateau, there is an area of foothills and low ridges, leading at their base down to a broad, flat, windswept plain with a river flowing through it out to the Aegean. So it has long been thought that Troy must have been somewhere in this broad region, which came to be called the Troad, or the land of Troy. But this is a very wide area, and by the time modern archaeology came along in the 1800s, there were no visible remains of any ancient Bronze Age city anywhere around. So what to make of this? One could suppose, for one thing, that Troy was just entirely fictitious. It was simply an imagined city inserted into a sketchy version of a real landscape for the sake of drama. Or it is tempting also to look for clues in the Iliad. The story gives only a broad, vague description of the landscape around Troy, but it does sometimes include some strikingly vivid details of the fights between these warriors on the two sides. The most climactic of these, of course, for those who are familiar with the Iliad, is the fight between the leading warrior of the Achaeans, called Achilles, and the prince and war commander of Troy, named Hector. And this scene begins with Hector seeing Achilles approaching him on the battlefield, and Hector runs away. Achilles then chases him several times around the perimeter of the walls of Troy. And in the modern translation of this passage by Samuel Butler, we're told, quote, "As a mountain falcon, swiftest of all birds, swoops down upon some cowering dove, even so did Achilles make straight for Hector with all his might, while Hector fled under the Trojan wall as fast as his limbs could take him. On they flew along the wagon road that ran hard by under the wall, past the lookout station, and past the weather-beaten wild fig tree, till they came to two fair springs which feed the river Scamander. One of these two springs is warm, and steam rises from it as smoke from a burning fire, but the other even in summer is as cold as hail or snow or the ice that forms on water. Here, hard by the springs, are the goodly washing troughs of stone, where in the time of peace, before the coming of the Achaeans, the wives and fair daughters of the Trojans used to wash their clothes." End quote. So these details show, on the one hand, Homer's sense of irony and tragedy, that right at the height of this climactic fight, at the culmination of the story of the war, Homer throws in this tangible, vivid image of ordinary peacetime life, which has been taken away from the Trojans, when he refers to this spot where women used to wash their clothes, a place where surely one would hear chatter and gossip, much like at a laundromat in modern day. And he also includes these precise descriptions of the two springs, one hot and steaming, the other icy cold, even in summer. And this is a very evocative, even visceral image. The Greeks were a bathing people, like the Romans, and they could probably vividly imagine the feelings of luxuriating in this spring water out of doors. And again, this is a basic pleasure that the Trojans must have taken for granted until it was snatched away from them by war, and they were trapped inside their city with only enough water to drink from cisterns. So these details put in here at this pivotal moment in the poem are so strangely specific and vivid. We must be tempted to ask, is there a reality here? Is this just an invention of Homer's poetic imagination, or is this a surviving, fragmentary memory of the real Troy? And this uncertainty of what is just poetic imagery and what is a real clue, this uncertainty would underpin a lot of the debate, starting in the 1700s, over whether or where it was possible to find the remains of the real Troy. So as of the 1700s, it became possible for more Europeans to travel into the Ottoman Empire, which at that time ruled over all of Anatolia. And some antiquarians were inspired by the excavation of Pompeii and other Roman sites, and they began to speculate in a serious way about where the original Troy might have been, or whether it could even be uncovered. And opinion diverged into three basic schools, you could say. For one, those who believed that the most likely site of Troy was at Bunarbashi, a large, rugged hill with a village on top, overlooking the southern end of the plain of the Troad. Secondly, those who favored another somewhat smaller and lower hill farther north called Hisarlik, which was slightly closer to the seashore and the Dardanelles. And thirdly, those who believed that Troy was purely legendary and could not be located any more than Atlantis or El Dorado. But if we put that third group aside and look just at those who did think that it might be possible to find the site of Troy, it seems that early on in 1768, a German antiquarian named Johann Hermann, who was a friend and student of J.J. Winckelmann, the first great scholar of classical art, Hermann traveled to the Troad in Anatolia, and he suggested that the site of Troy might be Hisarlik, and it was marked later on, especially on German maps, as the site of some sort of ancient ruins, which makes sense too with the place name. Hisarlik in Turkish means the place of the fortress. In 1801, two British scholars studied ancient Greek and Roman coins that referred to New Ilion, or the New Troy, and they surmised that the real site was at Hisarlik. And then in the 1830s and the 1860s, the Scottish geologist Charles Maclaren published books about the plain of Troy, and he also argued for Hisarlik as the site of the original Troy. But meanwhile, another school of thought arose in parallel, started mainly by French scholars. So in 1785, the French antiquarian Jean-Baptiste Le Chevalier also examined the area of the Troad, comparing the landscape against the descriptions in the Iliad, and he concluded that the site was the village of Bunarbashi on a larger hill farther south. And further, that the citadel, or Pergamos, the sort of high enclosed city of Troy, was located on a high outcropping above the village called Balidag. One of his reasons for this supposition was the numerous springs that flowed out from the sides of the hill at Bunarbashi. And Le Chevalier's book became very influential, and it seems that most amateurs interested in the question assumed that Le Chevalier was right, and the most likely site of Troy was at Bunarbashi. And this contest ended up coming to a head in the 1860s. So in 1864, the German diplomat Johann Georg von Hahn began to excavate at Bunarbashi in hopes of uncovering Troy. And he did end up finding various foundations of ancient buildings, suggesting an ancient city. But they dated from the 7th to the 5th centuries BC, in other words, the classical Greek age. Hence, they were way too late to be the Homeric Troy, which supposedly was destroyed in the 1100s BC. But no matter, von Hahn declared that he had confirmed Le Chevalier's theory and located Troy. And a few years later, in 1871, the Prussian Academy of Science sent a team to Bunarbashi to view and examine the site. But in the meantime, those more closely familiar with the local landscape in the Troad still held more to the Hisarlik theory. Most importantly of all, Frank Calvert, who was the scion of an Anglo-Levantine family, in other words, a long-running clan of originally English extraction, but that had lived for many years in the Ottoman Near East. And Frank Calvert had served as a consul representing first Great Britain and then the United States in the Ottoman Empire. The family had a large house and farm in Çanakkale, an Ottoman town in the Troad on the south shore of the Dardanelles. And in the 1840s, Calvert had traveled with Russian cartographers' missions, mapping the area of the Troad. And he became persuaded that Hisarlik was the true site of Troy, and he persisted in that belief regardless of von Hahn's finds at Bunarbashi. In 1863, Calvert tried to convince the British Museum to fund excavations at Hisarlik, but he was refused. The following year, in 1864, Calvert bought with his own money a part of the eastern side of the hill of Hisarlik, and in 1865 he paid for preliminary digs of test pits and small trenches along the northeastern side of the hill, and they uncovered artifacts from the classical and archaic ages, which, for one thing, most importantly, demonstrated that the hill of Hisarlik was a tell or tepe, meaning a largely artificial hill with layers built up from construction and rubble through the years. But the excavation then stalled for lack of money and labor, and especially now that attention was being drawn away to the supposed finds at Bunarbashi. However, in mid-August 1868, Calvert was visited at the family mansion in Çanakkale by a wealthy German businessman who had been touring around Greece and Anatolia viewing ancient sites. He was 46 years old and had recently retired from his career in business, wanting to make a name for himself in the worlds of science and scholarship. And by this time he was especially curious about Troy, and his name was Heinrich Schliemann. This is a name that will forever be linked to that of Troy, and in many ways one could say that he has come even to overshadow what he discovered. He can be seen as a towering figure of the 19th century, and in some ways representative of that age, in his indomitable ambition, his belief in the unlimited ability of man to overcome obstacles, embodied most of all, of course, in himself, whom he presented as a self-made man who rose to take on and defeat one of the great challenges of modern times, like scientists like Thomas Edison or Charles Darwin, or statesmen like Disraeli or Lincoln. And he strove to be seen as self-defining, a free-thinking iconoclast, like the great minds of the Victorian age, like Karl Marx or Friedrich Nietzsche. But also, like Nietzsche, or perhaps even more so, he was quintessentially modern in how he linked himself to the ancients, presenting himself as a kind of new Agamemnon venturing into the East to conquer that great mysterious city of legend. But most of all, in retrospect, looking back over his life, he can be seen to echo, in an uncanny way, Homer's greatest hero, which is Odysseus. a man of towering vanity, ambition, and courage, who is able to complete his seemingly impossible quest due to his sheer persistence, his ruthlessness, and most of all, his great cunning, his talent for storytelling, for persuasion, and for deceit. And in recent years, Heinrich Schliemann's enormous career and character have been called into serious question. But even his critics cannot deny the enormity of his achievements, which may be, like those of the great epic heroes, inseparable from his flaws. So this is all to say that for better or for worse, we need to talk about Heinrich. So Heinrich Schliemann was born in a small village in Mecklenburg, a relatively poor area of northeastern Germany along the Baltic coast. And he came from a fairly modest family of mainly Lutheran clergymen. He was the fifth of 9 children. His father, Ernst Schliemann, was appointed in 1823 as the minister of a small town in Mecklenburg called Ankershagen. And it seems that the young Heinrich did reasonably well in school. But in 1831, when he was 9 years old, his mother died, and his father then sent Heinrich away to live with an uncle who was also a minister in a larger town. And initially, the father did pay for further schooling for Heinrich, but it seems that the father Ernst was also very dissolute, with many debts from business and gambling, and he also was lavishing extravagant gifts upon the family maid, who it became very clear was his mistress, to the point that eventually the congregants in Ankershagen literally drummed him out of town. So at this point, the income has been lost, the family is basically broke, Heinrich is forced to withdraw from school, and from the age of 14, he was sent to work as a shop assistant at a grocery in the town of Fürstenberg. And there he did a great deal of back-breaking work, including carrying heavy crates of merchandise. At the age of 19, he was injured. He burst a blood vessel when lifting a heavy barrel and coughed up blood. He then left the shop and traveled west to Hamburg, the great port city of Germany, and he hoped to find in Hamburg some sort of work to support himself. And he also was drawn to the idea of embarking and traveling abroad. After not long, he got passage on a ship called the Dorothea, which was bound for Venezuela, where he had been promised a job. The Dorothea embarked at the beginning of December 1841, and it sailed right into a brutal winter storm, with driving snow, high winds, and waves. It ran aground on a shoal in the sea near the Netherlands. Some of the crew, as well as Heinrich, were able to reach the tidal sandbanks off the shore of a Dutch island called Traill, where they were then rescued. Heinrich's body, when he was brought into Amsterdam, was covered in bruises and lacerations, and 2 of his teeth were knocked out. As he was recuperating in Amsterdam, a German consul offered to pay to take him back to Hamburg, but Heinrich refused. He decided to stay in Amsterdam. Heinrich said in his later writings that at this point he felt a sense of calm and resolve, a sense that he must have been spared for a reason, and hence was destined for great things. And this might be true, maybe, but certainly it could also be part of his extravagant self-mythologization, which is seen also in his copious exaggerations and embellishments of his own life story, such as his claim that he was one of only 3 survivors of the shipwreck and had gotten ashore by clinging to an empty floating cask. But regardless, in Amsterdam, Heinrich got work doing odd jobs, mainly as a messenger and errand boy for the mercantile houses in the city. He lived in a cheap garret, socialized very little, and spent his spare time studying languages. He learned languages with extraordinary speed and thoroughness, whether through talent or through sheer persistence and doggedness. He mastered first Dutch, English, and French, and then soon after became conversant in Italian, Spanish, and Portuguese. Also, later on in his life, he mastered Arabic, Turkish, Swedish, Latin, and Greek. And he adopted the custom when traveling, which he often was, of writing his letters and diaries in the language of whichever country he happened to be in at the time. But that would only come a bit later. In March 1845, when he's 23 years old, he is hired as an office boy by the prestigious merchant house H.B. Schroeder and Company. and he soon shows ability and meticulousness as a bookkeeper and accountant. Now, the Schröder firm handled a great deal of trade from Western Europe and the Dutch Empire to Russia through their trading partners and contacts in St. Petersburg. In particular, they were the major suppliers of indigo, grown especially in the Dutch East Indies, into the new emerging Russian market. The main problem that they faced, though, was that their communications with Russian buyers were limited by the fact that no one at the firm spoke Russian. So naturally, Schliemann decides to learn it. And he wants a teacher, but hardly anyone in the Netherlands speaks Russian, and the Russian consulate will not help him. So he gets a grammar and a lexicon and a Russian translation of a French novel, The Adventures of Telemachus, which is on a theme taken from the Odyssey, and he drills himself to learn the basics of the language. After a few months, he becomes the main Russian interpreter for the firm, and in 1846, the house appoints him as their agent in St. Petersburg. So Schliemann goes to St. Petersburg and acts as an agent for his employers and also opens up his own trading house, making large profits off of goods from Germany, the Netherlands, the Americas, and Asia. He's soon accepted into the city's mercantile guild, and he starts looking for a wife, and it seems he makes at least 2 proposals but is turned down both times. And Heinrich is very insecure about his looks. He believes that he is not handsome or tall or very charming, but his advantage is that he is increasingly rich, and this is what he decides to capitalize on. In 1850, Heinrich learns that his brother, Ludwig, who had traveled to America to make money from the California gold rush, has died in Sacramento. So he sails to America and crosses the country in order to settle his brother's affairs. And once he's in Sacramento, he puts up a gravestone for his brother, and then he opens up a shop to buy gold dust from prospectors and resell it to banks, including, for one, the Rothschilds, who have a purchasing agent in San Francisco. And it seems Schliemann makes enormous profits, basically doubling his fortune in a year and a half, until the Rothschilds' agent in San Francisco starts to accuse him of fraudulent practices, like underpacking the shipments of gold dust that he was selling to the Rothschilds. And after this point, Heinrich quickly packs up and leaves town and heads back to Europe. Now, Heinrich's sojourn in America is significant because it produces some of his strangest tall tales. Later on in his life, Schliemann would claim to have met the President of the United States, Millard Fillmore, and his father, daughter, and wife, and conversed with them for a length of time in the White House. He also would claim to have been in San Francisco on the night of the Great Fire that destroyed much of the city in May 1851. And he has an entry in his diary from that time period describing how he had to wake up and evacuate from his hotel, run past city blocks as they were engulfed in flames, and take shelter on Signal Hill, from which he could then watch a large section of the city burning down. Now, some problems with this account in his diary, and as he retold it later, are that he has the date wrong. He dates it in June instead of May. The details all seem to be gleaned from newspaper dispatches from the time in California, which he could have read in Sacramento. And the page on which this diary entry is written was not part of the original binding of the journal. Rather, it was glued in later. Now, this can seem especially weird. So Heinrich seems to be not only mythologizing himself and his experiences in retrospect, as many people do, right, who want to be famous, but he's even forging and falsifying his own records at the time. And why would he do this? Apparently, it seems in anticipation of being able to use them at some point in future to make grandiose, dramatic claims about his life. So this can be seen as pretty extreme and strange, even for the most self-aggrandizing personalities in history. But regardless, by the end of 1851, he returned to St. Petersburg even richer, and he now was able to secure the hand in marriage of a lady named Ekaterina Lishina, with whom he then embarked on a 17-year-long unhappy marriage. It seems they were really very poorly matched. But the marriage did produce 3 children, 2 daughters and a son, whom Heinrich loved and was devoted to. In 1853, the Crimean War broke out, and Russia was now more than ever in need of supplies and scarce goods from the West, which they could not obtain from France or Britain. So now Schliemann makes even more of a killing from trafficking consumer goods like indigo and saltpeter, a crucial mineral needed to manufacture gunpowder. Now, once the dust settles at the end of this war, after 1856, Schliemann is now among the richest merchant magnates in St. Petersburg. But it seems that this is where the real malaise sets in, what you could see as a kind of midlife crisis, possibly the most consequential midlife crisis in history. Heinrich had long seen himself as an exceptional man, worldly and intelligent and destined for great things. And now, possessing a great fortune, a large house in St. Petersburg, and a wife that he disliked was really not enough for him. At least as early as 1859, he started explicitly speculating about the idea of retiring from trade and taking up some higher pursuit, perhaps something intellectual, but he was not sure what. For 5 years, he dithered and was held back by business and family obligations. And moreover, he feared that even if he did quit his career in trade, there was not much intellectual milieu in St. Petersburg, and hence he wanted to move west to Berlin or Paris. But his wife Ekaterina refused and had no interest in intellectual life or life abroad. So he became more and more persuaded that he should split from his wife. In 1864, he finally closed down his mercantile house, retired from business, and sought to take up a life of learning and exploration. He was 42 years old. So the first thing that Schliemann did, it seems, was he embarked on a 2-year-long world tour, traveling all around Italy and the Mediterranean, including North Africa and Egypt. He sailed to India and traveled around the subcontinent, including Delhi and Calcutta. He traveled then through Southeast Asia, including both Indonesia and the mainland. He toured China, including Canton, Shanghai, and Beijing. And he also landed for a time at Edo in Japan, before then sailing across the Pacific to the west coast of America, passing through the Panama Canal, visiting Mexico and Cuba, before finally returning to Europe. Now, many of these places that Heinrich visited were familiar to Europeans. The most unusual were China and especially Japan. So in the early 1860s, this was still before the Meiji Restoration, when Japan was in a state of really chaos and instability after the incursion of Westerners, and when it was still pretty dangerous for Europeans even to set foot in the country. So Schliemann knew that his observations of East Asia were the most important and significant for a Western audience. So naturally, while on the ship crossing the Pacific from Japan to America, he wrote the first draft of a book in French titled La Chine et le Japon au temps présent, or China and Japan in the present day. And this became his first experience with publishing. And now as an author, he was given an entree into the intellectual world of Paris, where he resettled and started attending lectures at universities on fields like geography, ethnology, archaeology, and other emerging disciplines in the Victorian age. And this, it seems, is where he first became interested in ancient Greek archaeological sites. Now, if you read books and biographies and blurbs about Schliemann, you'll often see the claim put forward that uncovering Troy was the great lifelong obsession of Heinrich Schliemann. And this is not true. And you'll see stories like he was given a children's history book as a child, and he was fascinated by the scenes of the Aeneid with Aeneas fleeing from the burning Troy. Well, this is almost certainly made up after the fact, because there are copious writings by Schliemann from his childhood all the way up through his whole career, diaries, letters. He never mentions Troy and shows almost no interest in archaeology or ancient Greece until the 1860s, until he's right on the cusp of making his great discovery. So it seems that this is another retrospective self-mythologization. But regardless, as of 1867, he's now living in Paris apart from his wife, but he still wants some relationship with his children, and so he decides to try to get a divorce. Now, at this time, divorce laws were more liberal in the United States, and he can possibly claim U.S. citizenship because he happened to be living in California at the time when it first became a state. So he should be granted automatic U.S. citizenship. So by the end of 1867, he traveled to New York, and he found that he could not so easily meet the requirements for a divorce. You had to show some sort of misconduct like adultery. But not being one to squander an opportunity, he also rode around the Midwest on railroads in which he held stock. And in January 1868, he returned to New York. So 1868 turns out to be the really pivotal year. So in January, he returned from New York to Paris after having failed to get a divorce. Later in the winter, he attended lectures at the Sorbonne and the Collège de France on geography, ethnography, and so on. In April, he planned a trip back to St. Petersburg to see his family, and he decides that on the way he will go through Italy, Greece, and Constantinople. And he starts off his Italian tour, including Milan and Florence, and in May he got to Rome. When he was there, it seems he was mainly interested in seeing Renaissance and Baroque art. He was not especially interested in Roman ruins, but it seems he did view excavations that were ongoing on the Palatine Hill and along the Tiber River, sponsored by the Pope. In June, he continued on to Naples and saw the major sites of the Bay of Naples, including Pompeii, which was the main attraction in the area, as well as the Archaeological Museum with a great deal of Roman art, and the Palace of Tiberius on the island of Capri. In July, he sailed on to Greece. His first stop was the island of Corfu at the northwestern corner of Greece, and there he sought out a spot on a river which it seems is mentioned in the Odyssey. So this is the first indication of him taking a particular interest in sites connected to the Homeric epics. Then from Corfu, he went on to visit 3 areas of Greece and the Aegean that have important archaeological sites. Firstly, Ithaca, then the Peloponnesus, the peninsula at the southern end of Greece, and then the Troad. And effectively, you can see him here retracing Odysseus's journey, right, where he had to leave Troy and make his way across the Aegean and then back around to Ithaca. Now, Schliemann is retracing those steps in reverse. And he keeps a detailed diary of this journey. And after returning home, he wrote up a book in French about his journey and what he saw, called Ithaque, le Péloponnèse et Troie, or Ithaca, the Peloponnesus, and Troy. And a lot of his accounts in this book seem to be genuine, but also a lot is dubious, and does not even match his own records in his diary. Firstly, he spent 9 days in Ithaca, and according to his diary, he toured around villages and scenic spots. He visited markets with antiquities and bought ancient artifacts, such as vases and coins, that had been collected around Mount Aetos in Ithaca. He then traveled to the top of this mountain, which is traditionally thought to be the site of Odysseus's palace. And there he found and measured a series of cisterns and building foundations. He hired a workman and began digging. They found a knife blade, small fragments of swords, a ceramic figurine of a priestess, and then the workman uncovered the most significant find, which was several broken and intact ancient vases that have ashes and bone inside, probably representing funereal burials of the remains of people who'd been cremated. Now, if one looks into his book rather than his diary, in the book, Schliemann recounts many incidents that are very dubious, such as supposedly being harassed by angry dogs, whom he then mollifies by sitting down quietly on the ground until the owner arrives. And this incident is not mentioned at all in the diary, but it seems to be patterned closely on an incident in the Odyssey. So somewhere along the way here, Schliemann is starting to see himself as a kind of modern-day Odysseus. As for the artifact finds, there are many discrepancies and dubious anecdotes in the book. It claims that in his second day on the island, Schliemann went to the village of Leuke. He read out passages of the Odyssey to a gathering crowd of villagers, who then came and offered him a collection of ancient coins for free. But supposedly he then insisted on paying for them. So again, this is not in the diary and seems to be a sort of self-glorifying fabrication for the book. Then, on July 13th, he started his dig on the top of Mount Aetos. And this story also changes in the book. He says he hired 4 workmen rather than just 1. He found the vases filled with ashes himself, so he's giving himself the credit. And he also speculates, quote, "It is very possible that I have in my 5 little vases the bodies of Ulysses and Penelope and their offspring," end quote. Now, this is purely speculative and is worded as such, and that's fair enough. But it's the sort of flight of fancy that starts to make Schliemann famous, right? These sort of overblown claims that he somehow reached right to the ancient times, the times of Homer. Most importantly, the excavation on Mount Aetos, according to the book, the excavation on Mount Aetos comes first, before the visits to markets, where he buys various items, including a knife. Now, this cannot just be an innocent mistake. Schliemann has everything written down clearly in his diary, and probably he rearranged the chronology in order to dispel any idea that the artifacts he found on the mountaintop were actually purchased from antiquities dealers. And maybe this is just a little white lie, and the finds are genuine from the site on the mountaintop, but it does not look good for Schliemann's credibility. On July 20th, he sailed from Ithaca to Piraeus, the port near Athens, and there he met with groups of several Greek scholars and antiquarians, and with a German architect named Ernst Ziller. And Ziller had taken part in the dig that we mentioned before by von Hahn at the Troad, specifically at Bunarbashi and Balidag in 1864. And he had found their old materials, and Ziller, like von Hahn, was convinced that Bunarbashi was the site of Troy. This conversation evidently fired Schliemann's imagination, and Schliemann began to see an opportunity for great or momentous discoveries. He canceled his passage on a French steamship, which he was supposed to take to Constantinople, the next leg of his journey. And instead he got a ticket for an Austrian ship, which would be sailing several days later and which would make a stop at the Troad on the way to Constantinople. So he had not been planning on this before, right? Looking for Troy was not something he had set out to do. It's something, it seems, he thought of during this sojourn in Piraeus. Now, of course, since he'd rebooked his passage on this Austrian boat, he now had several days to kill in the meantime. And he took a side trip to see old sites around the Peloponnesus, including, most importantly, Mycenae, which is the ancient legendary capital of the king Agamemnon, described in the Iliad. And he saw there the so-called Cyclopean walls built of massive blocks fitted together without mortar, that encircle the upper city of Mycenae, and he saw the famous Lion's Gate with flanking lion structures that go through these walls into the ancient citadel of Mycenae. He also saw the enormous, partly underground, beehive-shaped enclosure, which was commonly called the Treasury of Atreus, which stands on a hillside just outside the walls. So Schliemann was aware that the Roman-era writer Pausanias had gone in the 2nd century AD during the Roman era. He had gone to Mycenae, and he described seeing large underground treasuries and underground tomb chambers, including those of Agamemnon and his retinue within the city walls, as well as those of Clytemnestra and Aegisthus, Agamemnon's wife and her lover, who had supposedly murdered Agamemnon, and those tombs were located outside the city walls, because they were seen as lower status. Now, as of the 1860s, most antiquarians tended to think that the large beehive structure called the Treasury of Atreus was in fact one of those treasuries referred to by Pausanias. And therefore, since it's a treasury and no king would be foolish enough to put his treasury outside the city walls, there must therefore have been larger, wider encircling city walls, now lost, that surrounded the whole city. Therefore, by this reasoning, which was the sort of conventional wisdom of the time, the tomb of Agamemnon must have been somewhere in that wider enclosure, while those of Clytemnestra and Aegisthus were even further outside, beyond the citadel. And this tends to make sense because space within a citadel is very valuable, and it was not common to put tombs inside it. You wouldn't waste space in that way. Now, Schliemann, for his part, when he examines Mycenae, he ignores this consensus view, and he just takes at face value what the ancient text says and matches it up directly with what he sees. He says, Pausanias says that Agamemnon's tomb is within the city walls, and I see here a complete circle of city walls, so the tomb must be within them. And this becomes his conviction. And you can see this as crucially reflective of Schliemann's approach. Commonsensical, even simplistic, willing to ignore scholarly reasoning just to go with the plain meaning of the text as he sees it and matching it up to the plain appearance of the landscape in front of him. And as we'll see in this case, Schliemann turned out to be right. On August 4th, he returned to Athens, and on the next day, on the 5th, he embarked on his steamship to the Troad. Now, he spent most of August then in the Troad, and according to his book, Itacle Péloponnèse et Troie, according to the book, on the first day, he went immediately to Bunarbashi, accompanied by an Albanian guide, and he looked for the springs referred to in the Iliad. And very quickly, he found 3 springs right on the hillside. And then as he explored further down, he found another 31 springs coming out of the lower slopes around the hill. His Albanian guide tells him there are even more, a total of 40. And Schliemann claims in the book that he took out his pocket thermometer and tested the temperature of the springs and found that they were all the same, 17 degrees centigrade, fairly cool. And he takes this as an initial indication that Bunarbashi does not, in fact, match the scene in the Iliad. The next day, he reportedly walked around the site, and he found that towards the river, at the base of the hill facing the river, the earth sloped down very steeply, 45 degrees or more, such that it was very hard even to walk on and really impossible to run on. And hence, he concluded it was inconceivable that 2 men, like Achilles and Hector, could have run around the city walls 3 times. He then proceeded up to the higher outcropping called Balidag and found a suspicious lack of any pottery, unlike in Mycenae, where there were fragments of pottery all around. And as a final test, he got local workmen to dig trenches in the stretch from the main plateau up to the higher hilltop, and found in these trenches no signs of habitation. In the book, Schliemann claims that these excavations went on for 4 days with a large team, when in his diary he said it was only a day and a half with just a few men. But regardless, whichever account is correct, and we would tend to think the diary is more accurate, regardless either way, Schliemann came away certain that Bunarbashi could not be the site of Troy. Now, the book that he published does not say exactly what happened for the next several days after that. There's a bit of a gap. And also, in his diary, it seems that a chunk has gone missing. And the entry for August 10th begins suddenly mid-sentence, for whatever reason. And in this account from the 10th, it seems he is already at Hisarlik, the other hill that we've talked about further north. And he's been taken there guided by the barber from a nearby village who happens to speak Arabic, which Schliemann also knows. And there Schliemann sees the remains of some marble columns and walls with cyclopean stones, those enormous, dressed, unmortared blocks like you see at Mycenae. Also, he observes that the hill has a stunning view out over the plains to the sea, rather like is described as the view from the towers of Troy in the Iliad. However, in the diary, there is still no mention here of the idea that this hill could be the site of Troy. And furthermore, the exact reasoning and chain of events of why he went to Hisarlik this first time on August 10th is unknown and is not discussed in the diary or the book. Now, according to the book, this whole episode is not even mentioned. Instead, in that account, the first time he goes to Hisarlik is on August 14th. And in that account, he examines the site carefully and quickly is convinced it is the site of Troy. He notes that the hill is fairly spacious and broad, and as he begins to excavate, again with some hired workmen, he finds the base of a large building. And he credits Frank Calvert with already having shown that the hill was a tell, built up over a long stretch of time with many layers, one on top of another. He also notes that the hill has gentle slopes all around, which would be possible to run around. At 3 p.m. of the 14th, according to the book, he then dismisses the workmen, having already been convinced that he has found the site of Troy. He then heads to a nearby village for the night. Over the following few days, he travels further around the Troad, seeing sites of ancient tombs and some ruined buildings. So, again, according to Schliemann's account in his book, it was on this visit on the 14th, and based on his own observations there, that he became persuaded that Hisarlik is Troy. But is this true? Well, the next day is very important. So, in an incident that he barely alludes to in his book, on August 15th, Schliemann went to Çanakkale on the Dardanelles, and he visited Frank Calvert at the family house. And this visit is known from Schliemann's letters and also from Frank Calvert's own writings and accounts. So when visiting the Calvert house, Schliemann sees their collection of relief sculptures, pottery, and other artifacts that they have collected from their own small excavations in the area, especially at Hisarlik, which they firmly believe to be the site of Troy. Frank Calvert's account of this visit is recorded, and he says that he was very excited, and it seemed possible that this wealthy man from Germany had the passion, the ambition, and the money to finally seriously excavate the site. And according to Calvert's writings, when Schliemann visited, he seemed at the time to be unaware that Hisarlik was considered a major candidate for the site of Troy. So if we believe Calvert's version of events here, it was he and his family who convinced Schliemann that Hisarlik was the place. He then made another visit down to Hisarlik on the 16th, and then he embarked for Constantinople. On August 22nd, when he was in Constantinople, he wrote a letter to his sister and his father in Germany, in which he wrote, quote, "Next April I intend to lay bare the entire hill of Hisarlik, for I consider it certain that I will find there Pergamos, the citadel of Troy." He got back to Paris in September, and he threw himself into research on the archaeology of Greece and Turkey. And he blended together information from this research and from his visits into the book that we've been describing, which he finished in December. And the book is significant, too, in that he put forward important arguments here, including that the crucial, important tombs of Mycenae were within the surviving city walls, and also that the most likely site of Troy was Hisarlik. And he includes in the book his account of his supposed visit there on August 14th. But his account is apparently, it seems, a concocted story. As soon as the book was done, he wrote to Frank Calvert, asking about how to prepare for excavations. Quote, "When is the best time to begin the work? Can I get laborers enough? Where and at what wages? What sort of hat is best against the scorching sun?" And so on. He then continued his travels northward into the Russian Empire, and on January 2nd, 1869, he arrived back in St. Petersburg. He tried to reconcile with his wife, but was unable, and a major issue dividing them was that the wife did not want to leave Russia. In March, Schliemann traveled to New York, again to try to get a divorce. But he also learned that other states had more lax and easier processes for getting a divorce. So in April, he traveled on to the state of Indiana, where his main hurdle was that he had to show 5 years residence in the state, which he did fraudulently by buying a house, investing in a factory, and paying off a witness to attest for him that he was resident in the state. Finally, he got back his divorce at the end of June, and in July, he went back to New York and then sailed to Paris. While he was away on this third journey to the United States, Heinrich's cousin Adolf sent his writings to the University of Rostock in Mecklenburg, requesting that they be considered as a dissertation for a doctorate in philosophy. So Adolf sent Schliemann's 2 books in French, his one on China and Japan, and the other one on Ithaca, the Peloponnese, and Troy. And Schliemann also added on special introductions and commentaries to the Ithaca book in Latin and in ancient Greek. The committee examined them and responded, saying that the French was excellent, the Latin was good, the Greek was terrible and should never have been submitted. And as for the content of the works, the China and Japan book was really just a travelogue, not scholarly enough to consider. But the Ithaca book was excellent, with great knowledge of scholarship and archaeology of Greece. And they awarded him the doctorate. And from that point onward, Heinrich Schliemann liked to use the title of Doctor. Now also, at the same time in April, while he is still in America, Schliemann wrote to the Archbishop of Athens, whom he'd met when he was there in 1868. And he asked the Archbishop to help find him a Greek wife. The Archbishop sent back to him names and photographs of 2 women. One was a mature woman, a schoolmistress, and the other was a relative of the Archbishop's, a girl of only 17, named Sophia Schliemann. And Schliemann, it seems, did a kind of phrenology on these photographs, saying that the schoolmistress clearly was bossy and irritable, while Sophia was kindly, compassionate, full of life. But he also said that she was too young. And he asks the Archbishop for another match, perhaps a young widow who is more mature, worldly wise, and who would love learning. And he insists, quote, "I live now only in a metaphysical world, and I care for nothing except scholarship. My wife ought to have a great inclination for learning, because otherwise she cannot love and respect me." End quote. Now, this might have been partly Schliemann's own insecurity about his looks and his age. He was now in his 40s. But the next day, he suddenly changed his mind, and he wrote to the Archbishop again, saying that he was in love with Sophia and could take no other wife. This is all, of course, without ever having been even in the same country as Sophia. Now it seems he's just afraid that with his age and his years of celibacy, he may be impotent. But he assures the Archbishop that he will test this when he gets back to Paris. And if he is convinced that he is a decent fit, he will then go on to Athens to meet Sophia. And if they are compatible, he will propose to her. So you can see here in Schliemann this very strange, often conflicting mixture of romantic impulsiveness with practicality. And after getting back to Paris, he did then continue on to Athens, where he got permission from the family to visit Sophia. He finds that she is uneducated, but intelligent, and appreciates the classics, and could even recite passages of Homer when Heinrich requested it. But when he asks Sophia why she might want to marry him, she says that she is following her parents' wishes, which it seems Schliemann took as an insult, and he broke off the flirtation, prepared to leave and return to Paris. But Sophia argued then that she was just being honest, and she insisted that she would be happy with him and would show him respect and affection. So the courtship resumed, and just a week later, on September 23rd, 1869, they were married in Athens. And this weird incident you can see as perhaps showing Sophia's basic honesty and practicality. Just 2 days after the marriage, they left for Italy, touring through the country before then settling in Paris. And Sophia began studying French and Italian, but she became severely homesick and depressed. So in February 1870, they went back to Athens for a time, ostensibly temporarily. But when they got back to Greece, Schliemann had by that time 2 irons in the fire. For one, the French scholar Ernst Renan had asked Schliemann and urged him to excavate Mycenae in Greece. And they had even applied to the Greek government for permission to excavate, and had asked for the right for Schliemann to keep all the treasures that he might find. Meanwhile, at the same time, Frank Calvert in the Troad was applying to the Ottoman government, trying to get a firman or license for Schliemann to excavate at Hisarlik. So what were the results? The Ottomans took a very long time to process and respond to Calvert's requests. Greece initially turned down Schliemann's request for permission to excavate at Mycenae, so a lot of these hopes and plans were frustrated. Schliemann also was now fighting with his Greek in-laws over money, and he left Athens on his own without Sophia and took a tour of the Greek islands. After he returned to Athens, Greece then did offer permission for him to excavate at Mycenae on the understanding that all finds would be the property of the state, and that was the new law in Greece. So Schliemann reluctantly accepted this condition and got his license. But in the meantime, they were not prepared to start digging yet, and so, again, with some spare time to kill, he took another trip to Turkey, including of the Troad, and of several important cities, including Smyrna and Ephesus. But when he got there, he changed his mind, and he decided that his real priority was to begin preliminary excavations at Hisarlik. So without yet having a firman, he brought 4 workmen from the Dardanelles down to Hisarlik, and on April 9th, they started digging. He also, at this point, has no permission from the landowners. So the whole western part of the hill was privately owned by Ottoman shepherds and farmers, and he hadn't gotten permission from them. And he even wrote, quote, "Knowing in advance that the 2 Turkish owners would refuse to give me permission, I did not ask them." Now soon, while this dig was just getting started on April 11th, they learned that several foreign tourists at Marathon in Greece had been kidnapped by brigands and later murdered. And this caused a lot of shock and scandal, and it underscored how unsafe the remote parts of Greece were at this time. So Schliemann simply canceled his plans to excavate at Mycenae and now concentrated all his effort and attention on Troy. So he and his workmen opened up trenches on the summit of the hill, hoping to find major buildings of a citadel. And this was a total bust. They found nothing significant. They opened up 2 more trenches on the western slopes of the hill, and they found small objects like vases and coins. And most importantly, they found the bases of 5 different walls, crossing and crisscrossing through the hillside, some of them being superimposed one on top of another, which shows that there were different eras of construction. They included among them what seemed to be the base of a tower, possibly from the Greek era, and a long, thick wall, over 6 feet thick, that Schliemann supposed might be the enclosure of a temple of Athena, like the one described in the Iliad. Now, when reports were published of these excavations, Schliemann did some rearranging. He took these finds, such as the large wall and the coins, and he moved them up to the summit of the hill, which was not where they'd been found. But, he's massaging the data pretty aggressively. After this initial mild success, he then asked Frank Calvert to try to buy the whole site of Hisarlik from the Turkish owners. But they refused. They were furious at this trespassing and incursion into their property without permission. So there was no sale. Schliemann began his return journey back to Paris. And he wanted to take Sophia with him and permanently resettle them in Paris. But she was again ill and depressed and insisted on staying in Greece. As they were there, the Franco-Prussian War broke out, which devastated France, including the shocking occurrence of the bombardment of Paris. At the end of 1870, Schliemann then finally relented and decided to stay permanently in Greece, and he started to make plans to build a house for himself and Sophia in Athens. And this is where he and Sophia ended up residing, in a Greek Revival-style house, where they made a home and career together and had 2 children, whom they named Andromache and Agamemnon, after characters in the Iliad. As for his work, he committed everything to excavating Hisarlik. He went to Constantinople to try to speed up the granting of the firman, and over the rest of 1870, he also threw himself into learning Turkish, and by the end of the year, he was writing much of his diary in the Turkish language in Arabic script. By the beginning of 1871, the Ottoman government knew that Schliemann had been excavating on the western side of the hill without any permission from the owners or the state. And naturally, they were furious and distrustful. But they also knew that there was great potential value in this excavation, and that there was promise in this wealthy European businessman coming in willing to pay for the work himself. So what the Ottomans did is they seized ownership of the western part of the hill, requisitioning it from the Turkish owners. And Schliemann was forced to negotiate exclusively with the Ottoman government, and he proposed that he would pay the costs of excavation if they could split the fines 50-50 between himself and the state. And further, the Ottomans could appoint an agent to oversee the work and curate the fines and enforce this agreement. And the state's half would go to the Ottoman Imperial Museum in Constantinople, while Schliemann would be free to take his half away to Greece. So on these conditions, the Firman was finally granted and work began again in October 1871. The climate and conditions at Hisarlik were very difficult. For one thing, there were dangerous animals. The site was dense with mosquitoes, the mound was home to thousands of poisonous snakes that liked to nest in the crevices in the stones, and it was crawling with scorpions and venomous centipedes, which were only kept at bay by birds of prey like owls and hawks. The times of year when they could excavate were very limited. It was generally too scorching hot in most summers, especially later summer, and it was too rainy and wet in the winter. The trenches would turn to mud. And so they could really only excavate in the fall and spring. And even then, the site was extremely windy, with dirt and dust blowing in the workers' faces. But nonetheless, the work began in the fall of 1871 with a group of 70 to 80 workmen, mostly Greek Christians and also some Muslim Turks, especially filling in on Sundays. The different groups of workers were often competitive and mutually suspicious and had to be personally managed by Schliemann as a kind of neutral outsider. He built a wooden house for himself and a storehouse on the mound where he lived during the digs. And he later expanded this over the years into a whole village of wooden cabins and buildings, which visitors called Schliemannopolis. And Schliemann would stay here for months, overseeing the work, gathering, cataloging, and drawing the finds, and writing up reports in multiple languages to dispatch for publication in Greece, Germany, and France. Among the earliest finds, the most significant were 3 Greek inscriptions, which seemed to come from the Greco-Roman age, when the city was called Novum Ilium, or New Troy. They also found small ceramic jars with simple sculptural faces that looked rather like owls, and Schliemann speculated they might be related to the cult of Athena. But then going deeper into the mound, they started to find only very primitive objects, such as little stone and ceramic whorls, possibly used for looms or spindles, and then various simple tools like knives, hammers, and saws, all made of stone. And this was extremely disappointing. It seemed that in digging, they had gone right from the classical age directly to the Stone Age, suggesting that there was no city here between those two periods. Schliemann knew that Homeric Troy was the late Bronze Age, and he'd been hoping to find bronze objects, but there was nothing here. And what this seemed to indicate was that the hill might have been inhabited long before the Bronze Age and after, but not in between, and hence could not be the site of the legendary Troy. So this was very disturbing, and the culverts, it seemed, tried to reassure him, saying that perhaps the stone and terracotta objects had come in with fill brought into the site in order to shape the hilltop. But Schliemann was not convinced, and he was able to get some limited hope from finding a stray hand from a marble statue, which suggested that there might be small artworks from later than the Stone Age that he had missed somewhere along the way in digging. But this was a fairly thin reed on which to hang his hopes. So he started to entertain serious doubts that perhaps he had the wrong site after all. He still believed that Hisarlik was the most logical place for Troy to be, and hence if it was not here, perhaps it wasn't anywhere at all. So he starts to consider the possibility that in fact those scholars were right who had claimed that there was no Troy. But he consoled himself nonetheless that even if that was the case, this was still a significant finding. And he wrote quite reasonably, quote, All the archaeologists that have visited the plain of Troy have decided the question of the site of the ancient city, and some have reached their decisions without even visiting the plain, but all have resolved the question theoretically. Many scholars even think, because of the miraculous elements in the events described by Homer, that Troy never existed. But that is also theory. No one so far has ever taken the trouble to resolve this great question practically, as I am doing. And if by perseverance and at enormous expense I manage to prove that Troy never existed, I will be very happy if the scholarly world recognizes the merit in having resolved the question negatively." End quote. So there are several important things that Schliemann is saying here. For one thing, he acknowledges the signs are bad for his quest to find Troy, but he shows his characteristic stoicism and resilience. He's also very scientific. It is very true that negative results, disproving a favored hypothesis, are valid and valuable. They may not be as romantic or as sexy, you could say, but it's still an important contribution to knowledge. And also he shows his ultimate confidence in his own importance, reassuring himself that his achievement will still be great and unique and will deserve recognition. So in this spirit, he keeps digging, and in a deeper layer, they do start to find many bronze and copper objects, such as tools, nails, spearheads, and brooches. Then they uncover a large terracotta pot with ashes, like those that he had found previously in Ithaca. And this confirms to Schliemann that he was on the right track after all. Bronze Age Troy was at Hisarlik. Now, why would this be, that they would go through this dense layer of Stone Age remains with very primitive non-metal objects, and then deeper down start to find bronze? It seems backwards. And it was not clear why this would happen, but modern scholars have supposed that the center of the mound, by the summit, that there different settlements had been built through different eras, but not always directly one on top of the other. The mound was sometimes cleared and smoothed out before rebuilding, and hence material from later eras might sometimes be pushed aside and piled up around the slopes and mixed in with or even on top of later materials. So it is not such a neat, simple stratification like you might hope to find. And Schliemann interprets these findings differently. Rather, he concludes, with maybe some wishful thinking, he concludes that the deeper layers represent the Bronze Age, when the city was more sophisticated and prosperous. And these more crude and primitive items on the layer above represent a time of perhaps the Greek Dark Age, after the destruction of Bronze Age Troy. So therefore, he concluded that as he dug, he was getting closer to Homeric Age Troy, which therefore must be all the way down at the bottom. And so the excavation was wrapped up at the end of November, and Schliemann was determined to come back next year and to dig faster and deeper to reach the legendary city, which must logically lie at the bottom layer, just atop the bedrock. And he began looking for ways to speed up the excavation, even considering the idea of laying small rails, like in a mine, in order to haul away dirt and rubble by the cartload. In 1872, Schliemann hired a French engineer to survey the mound, who had worked previously in mines, as well as 3 more Greek foremen, including one who had worked in mines in Australia. In May, he was joined also by Sophia, who hated the discomfort and the deadly animals on the mound, but who came to the site anyway and stayed and worked there for a month, drafting and transcribing reports in Greek and practicing excavation with 2 workmen. Schliemann's dealings with the outside world, such as handling mail, dealing with banks and with the Ottoman government, procuring and repairing equipment, all of these tasks were handled by Frank Calvert, and Calvert also made arrangements with Schliemann similar to his arrangement with the Ottoman government, saying that Schliemann could excavate Calvert's section of the land, and remember he owned the eastern side of the hill. Schliemann could excavate there if all the finds were split 50-50. So now Schliemann made plans to cut an enormous trench, about 250 feet wide and 46 feet deep, into the middle of the mound in order to try to reach the platform, meaning the bedrock base, onto which he believed Bronze Age Troy must have been built. So Schliemann was using extremely aggressive tactics, and by today's standards, this would be considered highly improper. This rapid, aggressive invasion of the hill, which scattered, scrambled, or outright destroyed the remains of many layers of the mound. And in more recent times, some people have called this the second sack of Troy. And as the team excavated, they tore through or discarded materials like stone artifacts or low walls that they considered unimportant to the quest for Homeric Troy, including among them, ironically, many of those from the Bronze Age, which Schliemann was supposedly looking for. And Schliemann's theory that the Homeric Age must be at the lowest layer, it turns out, was wrong. But even if he'd been correct, his methods would still be considered unconscionable by today's standards, which require careful sifting and recording of all finds, no matter how small or seemingly insignificant, at every layer of a site. But in some ways, the condemnation that has been put forth of Schliemann's tactics, in some ways this can be unfair or anachronistic. Archaeology was just barely emerging as a discipline at this time. Norms of proper excavation were not yet universally shared. And Schliemann, what is more, he was excavating in order to test a specific valid hypothesis. And he was meticulous about gathering and recording information that was relevant to that hypothesis. And he had limited time and money to get what he believed was most historically significant, and he acted within those constraints to optimize the impact of every man-hour and every dollar put into the excavation. So, this is still debated, but be that as it may, he begins by cutting into the northern face of the hill and working in towards the summit. They find a large buttress wall and debris fill behind it with more stone and ceramic objects. Further in, they come to another wall, seemingly to a large building, perhaps a temple or large house, which they then demolish in order to dig deeper. They find more vases and 5 small gold ornaments or jewels, including a gold pin and what seem to be earrings. A French scholar in Athens writes to Schliemann and advises that he must record the exact location, including depth, of where you make each find, and only by reconstructing the layers of the site can the objects be dated. And from this point onward, Schliemann starts doing this. He does want to adopt and implement the latest archaeological techniques. They begin finding many more bronze objects, tools and weapons, as well as molds and crucibles, as from a metal workshop. And they find these in a layer several meters above the bedrock, which they then call Layer 2. And they begin to think that this layer is perhaps the actual Homeric Troy, and they want to uncover as much of it as they can. In June, the team starts to excavate the eastern part of the hill, the area owned by Calvert. And they begin by unearthing the foundations of a temple from the Roman era. And at this point, they also make the most dramatic find of the year, which is a segment of a sculptural frieze, probably from the facade of a temple, probably from the Hellenistic era, just before the Roman age. And this segment has 3 sections. On the left and right are triglyphs, which are simple relief sculptures of 3 columns. And in the center is a metope, a flat plaque with an elaborate relief sculpture showing the figure of a solar god with a sunburst emerging from the head and riding in a chariot pulled by 4 rearing horses. So this is a relief sculpture of stunning quality. The problem now is how to split it with Calvert. This is by far the most valuable thing found on the eastern side of the hill. And how do you split it? Well, Schliemann offers, for one thing, to buy off Calvert for half the value of the sculpture. He then proceeds to haggle for a very low price. And Calvert begrudgingly accepts this lower price. And Schliemann then asks Calvert further to transport the sculpture back to Athens, where Schliemann initially has it installed in his garden. Calvert also later finds out that in fact the sculpture is worth much more on the market than what Schliemann had claimed, and Calvert now feels very slighted and even betrayed. So Schliemann, with this find, he gets his first real mark of honor for his success, but it comes at the price of really losing the trust and support of Calvert. In August, they begin working again on the main large trench. They find the base of a large, thick wall reaching down all the way to the bedrock, and then of another wall nearby, which is almost parallel to it and seems to form some kind of enclosure. Schliemann imagines that these walls are the base of a large, tall tower overlooking the plain, and even identifies it with the great tower of Ilium, where the Trojans reportedly look out over the battles recounted in the Iliad. In fact, as it turns out, this was just a section of defensive walls of the city, built at different times, and hence why they're different and not exactly parallel. They also make many more small finds, such as beads, metal casting molds, and the skeleton of a woman, before they then head back to Athens towards the end of the year. Schliemann in Athens proceeds to photograph many of the finds, and he also sends photographers to Hisarlik to take photos of the excavation site. He then publishes reports of the finds over the winter of 1872-3. And again, he sometimes misreports where some important finds were actually uncovered. He claims in the reports that they had come from far down in the first or second layers, so as to make it seem that everything most interesting and dramatic came from that earliest age of Troy, which he supposes to be Homeric, even though in fact many of these objects had been found in higher layers and probably came from later eras. In these reports, Schliemann also talks about small, valuable items, especially gold, jewels, and beads, that he had not mentioned before in his own dispatches or even sometimes in his diaries. Evidently, it seems he took the advice, so we don't, it's been disputed why there's this discrepancy, why he's putting out publications with these valuable gold items that don't appear in his own earlier writings. Some have thought that maybe this was fraudulent. He'd bought them in other places and, salted the site with them, as one says. But evidently, the more likely explanation is that he took the advice of an American diplomat named John Brown, who wrote to him from Constantinople and said, quote, "When you find any small objects, put them in your pocket. And, quote, you must not find any big amount of gold or silver in your diggings." So what the American John Brown seems to be saying here is that if you find anything very valuable that could be pilfered by workers on the site, or perhaps that the Ottomans might try to requisition from you, then just keep your mouth shut and discreetly get them out of there. And it seems this establishes a pattern, that when Schliemann finds highly valuable items, he quietly takes them away back to his house, has them transported back to Greece, and says nothing about them until he's back in Athens. And this comes crucially into play then in the following year, in 1873, when Schliemann makes the most dramatic discovery, or alleged discovery, of his entire campaign at Troy. So work began again early on in February 1873, when the weather at Hisarlik was still freezing. His wife Sophia then joined later in mid-April. Early on the western side of the hill, the team found more Greek inscriptions, and Schliemann again haggled with Calvert over the price for full ownership of these inscriptions. And then he found more which he simply kept and never mentioned to Calvert or anybody. On the eastern side, in the enormous deep trench that's being extended further into the hill, the team found many layers of building and destruction, especially by fire. Schliemann wanted to believe, again, that the second layer from the bottom, which seemed to represent great wealth and splendor, represented Homeric era Troy. But now they're seeing there are so many layers from so many ages, everything is thrown into uncertainty. The team found many fragments of skeletons and of nearby objects such as copper vessels, weapons, and trinkets. So it would seem that these were probably burials with grave goods. But this presented a problem for Schliemann, because in the Iliad, the Trojans do not bury their dead, they cremate them. And so it seems Schliemann misreported these finds, saying that they had found 2 complete skeletons wearing war helmets, thus implying that these remains were casualties of war or of the sacking and destruction of the city, and hence could be fitted into the Homeric story of Troy. In April, they began cutting into the western slope of the hill, facing towards the plain and the sea. And they found a long, sloping, paved ramp climbing up the hillside from the west and leading into a large fortified gateway, which Schliemann identified with the so-called Scaean Gate in the Iliad, in front of which much of the action of the war took place. Further up and northward within the walls, they found the foundations of 2 large buildings, with the later one superimposed on top of the older one. And Schliemann identified the older building underneath as the Palace of Priam, the king of Troy in the Iliad. In early May, Sophia learned that her father back in Athens had died, so she left and returned to Greece. But Schliemann and the team kept cutting the western trench further into the hill until it met up with the trench that had been cutting into the hill from the north. It happens that his wooden cabin was near the corner of this intersection of the 2 trenches, and it was now perched precariously right over the edge of this massive intersecting trench network. On the morning of May 31st, Schliemann was in the large trench, looking at the remains of the western defensive wall, which was still embedded here into the side of the trench. While looking at the wall, he saw glints of metal objects, and he started trying to dig them out of the wall with a knife. Now, in a book, which he published a few years later, Schliemann gave an account of precisely what happened next and what he found, which has become famous and today is perhaps notorious, still known as one of the most dramatic and iconic and now controversial scenes in the entire history of archaeology. So this is what Schliemann described in his book called Troy and Its Remains. Quote, "In excavating this wall further and directly by the side of the palace of King Priam, I came upon a large copper article of the most remarkable form, which attracted my attention all the more, as I thought I saw gold behind it. On the top of this copper article lay a stratum of red and calcined ruins, from 4 3/4 to 5 1/4 feet thick, as hard as stone, and above this again lay the above-mentioned wall of fortification, which was built of large stones and earth, and must have belonged to an early date after the destruction of Troy. In order to withdraw the treasure from the greed of my workmen and to save it for archaeology, I had to be most expeditious, and although it was not yet time for breakfast, I immediately had paidos called, and this word paidos is a meal break. While the men were eating and resting, I cut out the treasure with a large knife, which it was impossible to do without the very greatest exertion and the most fearful risk of my life, for the great fortification wall beneath which I had to dig threatened every moment to fall down upon me. But the sight of so many objects, every one of which is of inestimable value to archaeology, made me foolhardy, and I never thought of any danger. It would, however, have been impossible for me to have removed the treasure without the help of my dear wife, who stood by me ready to pack the things which I cut out in her shawl and to carry them away." Schliemann then goes on in the book to list things that were found in that spot, including a copper shield, vase, and cauldron, a gold vase, goblet, and an oblong gold-handled dish, rather like a sauceboat in the shape of a ship, 5 silver vases, another goblet made of electrum, which is an alloy of copper, gold, and silver, 13 spearheads, 14 battle axes, 7 daggers, a knife, a large silver jar containing over 8,000 gold earrings and finger rings, and finally the pièce de résistance, 2 gold diadems or decorative headdresses made of intricately woven metal wire covered in tiny leaf-shaped gold ornaments and fringed with gold pendants. Schliemann reportedly had all of this treasure packed up and sent back to Athens, where it was carefully catalogued and photographed, and Schliemann soon after presented it to the world as Priam's treasure. And he says that he found it in a spot that would have been inside the building that he identified as the Palace of Priam. Hence, he implied he had uncovered the crown jewels of Homeric Troy, and he even called the gold diadems the, quote, Jewels of Helen. But can we know that this is true? Well, we have to consider his description of the discovery. So the scene of discovery is dramatic with high tension from the mystery and grandiosity of what he found and the danger both of theft and of structural collapse, which he says threatened his life. But there are problems with this account, and one at least should stand out right away as problematic. He says that his wife was there and that she smuggled the objects away in her shawl. But as we have seen, Sophia had already left the site and returned to Athens early in May. And both Schliemann's correspondence from the time and later witness accounts confirm that Sophia was not there. Schliemann acknowledged in a letter to a curator at the British Museum that he had lied about his wife helping him to extract the treasure. And he wrote to this curator in England, quote, "On account of her father's sudden death, Mrs. Schliemann left me in the beginning of May. The treasure was found end of May, but since I am endeavoring to make an archaeologist of her, I wrote in my book that she had been present and assisted me in taking out the treasure. I merely did so to stimulate and encourage her, for she has great capacities." End quote. And later in the letter, he seems to imply that it was actually the workman, not himself or Sophia, who extricated the treasures from the wall. So this calls into question then the whole account of this discovery. Can we really know that Schliemann found all of this splendorous treasure in one huge cache inside, supposedly, the Palace of Priam on May 31st? Well, we can know, for one thing, that he did find something on May 31st, because on that morning, the Ottoman supervisor at the site, Amin Effendi, heard from the workmen that Schliemann had just found a valuable treasure in the larger trench, and Effendi catches Schliemann sneaking objects into his cabin. Effendi angrily burst into the house and demanded that Schliemann unlock and open all of his chests and cabinets. When Schliemann refused, Effendi stormed off to get official authorization to confiscate all of Schliemann's finds. That evening, with Effendi temporarily gone, Schliemann begged Frank Calvert to lend him 3 horses in order to get his finds to a ship that night so that he could send them back to Greece. So the question then is just, what exactly did Schliemann smuggle away to Greece on that night? And did he really find all of it that morning in the spot where he said he did? Well, the evidence tends to say no. The diary makes no mention of this momentous discovery, but he did write up an initial report on that day, on May 31st, to send to his publishers in Paris. And in that initial report from the day, he says that he had just found a large number of valuable copper and bronze objects, which he then described with some precision. He also says rather vaguely that he found several dozen earrings, and he refers to some gold vessels, but says that he has not had much time to look at them. Schliemann in this initial report also makes no mention of the biggest finds, namely the jar with thousands of gold jewels, and the most dramatic and enduringly famous artifacts, the gold diadems, which he would call the Jewels of Helen. There's also inconsistency as of the place where the find was supposedly made. In most descriptions of the find, Schliemann says that it was on the outer face of the defensive wall. But in some versions, such as a draft report that he wrote on June 17th, so 2.5 weeks later, Schliemann says that it was in a small, narrow room inside the so-called palace, and he uses this to try to associate the treasure with King Priam. Other witnesses, such as the Greek workmen, would later say that the find spot was actually outside the city walls, a little bit northwest of the gates, not in the palace, which would tend to suggest it was something completely different, like a grave. So what really happened here? Well, probably, as especially the historian David Traill has argued, and as I think seems pretty convincing, Probably what happened is that over the course of the spring, Schliemann and his workmen, and maybe his wife as well, found various small gold jewels, including earrings, and gathered them up into a chest or a cabinet, together with other valuable objects such as gold vases, cups, and diadems, which may have come from all over the site. On May 31st, he also found some valuable copper and bronze objects just outside the city walls, probably from a grave. He discreetly put these away in his house, together with the stash of gold, jewels, and vessels. But on May 31st, when Effendi got wind of that day's find and demanded that Schliemann open his chests, Schliemann realized that the gig was up, and he had to get his entire hoard back to Greece right away. He then, in June, returned to Athens, and he combined this haul of treasure with some more items selected from the previous digs in 1871 and 72. So if one looks into the catalog and photos of the treasure, one can see 4 axes, a dagger, and a knife that had already previously been excavated, recorded, and photographed in prior years. So, all in all, the hoard that Schliemann presented to the world as Priam's treasure, in quotation marks, was evidently a concoction. It was an assemblage of grave goods and other valuable artifacts that Schliemann had found over the course of his excavations, and which told the story that Schliemann wanted. And it was undeniably a great story. When it was first published, it caused a great sensation. For the first few months, the entire hoard was kept carefully secret, including from the Ottoman government, although Schliemann sent out feelers to the British Museum and to the Louvre to see if they might buy the treasure. When they demurred in August 1873, a report on the find was finally published. In 1873-4, it toured the museums of Europe, making headlines and earning Schliemann invitations to prestigious, rarefied institutions like the Society of Antiquaries. The scholarly response was that although the attempt to link the treasure to Priam was ridiculous and unsupported, nonetheless the find in and of itself was still very impressive and indisputably momentous for the history of archaeology. Another problem, though, was that the Ottoman government had never been informed. They were the owners of the land, and they had given, as we said, permission to excavate on the understanding that they would get a 50-50 share of the findings. So it was effectively stolen goods, or you could say half-stolen. The Ottomans sued in Greek courts in 1874, thus preventing Schliemann from restarting further excavations at Hisarlik. The court case was long and arduous, and ultimately the Greek court found in favor of the Ottomans. It was a fairly clear-cut case. Schliemann had violated their agreement. Schliemann was ordered to pay 10,000 francs of restitution, which was a significant amount of money. And so in response, Schliemann paid 5 times that amount to the Ottomans and also donated some lower value artifacts to the Imperial Museum, as a way of trying to get back into the good graces of the Ottoman state. But nonetheless, the scandal had severely worsened his relations with the Ottomans and with the Calverts and others, and he probably felt that he had accomplished most of what he had set out to do in finding this treasure and gaining fame. So, what next? Schliemann was not one to sit around. And as we know, he had already been in talks with the Greek government about the possibility of excavating other sites, both Mycenae from the ancient Bronze Age and also Olympia, a later site on the Peloponnesus. And Schliemann did not like the rule that in Greece all finds had to become the property of the state, but he managed to negotiate a concession where the Greek government granted him permission to excavate at Mycenae on the conditions that the treasures would be his personal property, but only until his death, after which they would then pass to the ownership of the state, and he was allowed to excavate only within the citadel walls. Now, you might imagine Schliemann was probably rubbing his hands together at this point, because he already believed that the graves and tombs, including those of Agamemnon and his attendants, which the Romans had described, were within the inner enclosure, not outside, and now he had a chance to prove his hypothesis. So in 1876, he began excavating along with his wife and a Greek team, and they found a series of 5 shaft graves, or deep underground tombs reached through long vertical shafts. Each one was richly laden with artworks, such as gold vessels and jewels, bronze shields and weapons, including daggers and swords, with inlays in ivory, crystal, and amber, and most remarkably of all, several skeletons of men, women, and children, 7 of them with the skulls covered over by gold masks with elaborately sculpted effigy faces. So with this find, Schliemann supposes that these are the tombs of Agamemnon and his attendants. The largest and most detailed of the effigy masks he dubs the Mask of Agamemnon. There is also, you might see if you read about these finds, there's a long-standing legend saying that immediately after this discovery, Schliemann sent a telegram to King George I of Greece, saying, quote, "I have looked upon the face of Agamemnon." Now, this is not true, but the story persists, I think, because it captures this striking feeling of immediacy which one can feel when looking upon this very personal object with this vivid, distinctive face from more than 3,000 years ago. And the Mask of Agamemnon has become the most famous object that Schliemann ever found, and it's often reproduced on covers of books about Troy, even though it is not from Troy. It's from Mycenae and actually has nothing to do with Troy. And also, as it turns out, it is almost certainly not the Mask of Agamemnon, because it's even older than the alleged time of the Trojan War. So archaeologists estimate, based on the style, the material, and the context, that the tombs in Mycenae's citadel were laden with treasure around the 1500s BC, and this is still the most common view, and that puts it about 300 to 400 years before the supposed date of the Trojan War. But regardless of all that, this discovery at Mycenae has the effect of validating Schliemann's approach and suppositions, proving his abilities and perhaps the soundness of his intuitions, while also at the same time leaving Schliemann still unsatisfied, wanting still to get something closer to the Homeric age. Right? Again, he's overshot into an earlier era. So over the next several years, Heinrich and Sophia excavate other important remaining Bronze Age sites in Greece, including Orchomenos in Boeotia, a bit northwest of Athens, and Tiryns in the Peloponnesus, very close to Mycenae, where they discover a large buried palace with a magnificently painted ceremonial chamber. So these successes then attract the involvement of more trained and meticulous professional excavators who bring in newer, more precise and thorough methods, including a physician and antiquarian named Rudolf Virchow and an architect and builder named Wilhelm Dürrfeld. And with the new knowledge and methods that these new experts bring in, Schliemann turns his attention, after 1879, back to Troy. And this is partly because these new finds in Greece had uncovered many great artworks and artifacts clearly from the Bronze Age, even if they were a bit earlier than the supposed Trojan War. They were certainly from the Bronze Age, and none of them matched what he had found in Troy. The styles, methods, and materials were all different. So what could this mean? This created a dilemma. Either the two societies, Mycenaean Greece and Troy, were unconnected and isolated from one another. But this seemed to be impossible because of the geography and because it was contradicted in the Iliad, in which Schliemann still put great faith. According to the Iliad, the Trojans and the Greeks shared a common language. They spoke directly with one another. They also shared many of the same gods and mythology. So there was no way that these were two isolated, unconnected societies. Or, secondly, the other possibility was that the finds were coming from drastically different time periods, many centuries apart, and hence the treasures from Troy were either way too early or too late to be from the period he was looking for. So beginning in 1878, Schliemann restarted the excavations at Troy, advised first by Virchow and then after 1882 by Wilhelm Dürrfeld. They re-examined and surveyed the site and recommended new methods and interpretations. Virchow insisted on more carefully recording the exact positions of finds, including on the vertical axis, in order to reconstruct the layers. And they also began using comparative archaeology with other parts of the Near East in order to date them more exactly. They found several iterations of the city had been destroyed by fire and other disasters and then repeatedly rebuilt. Dürrfeld began to reconstruct the layouts of the buildings and even the streetscapes as they would have existed in different stages in the city's evolution. In 1882, several skeptical scholars, including British classicists, traveled to the site and were very impressed, but were still unsure that Schliemann had actually uncovered the legendary Troy. In 1883 to 84, as Schliemann's health was declining, he handed over more control of the excavation to Dürrfeld. And under his direction, it became more apparent to excavators that Schliemann may be wrong, in the sense that there were so many layers at Hisarlik with so much material that they could not all date from just the interval in between the Homeric period, which was the 1100s or so BC, and the Roman era. And in fact, they began to conclude that the deeper layers that they had been excavating and in which they'd found all of these gold objects must in fact be more ancient. But no one wanted to tell this to Schliemann. In 1884, as Schliemann was in worsening health, he decided that his work at Troy was done, and he packed up and went back home to Athens, and he looked into the possibility of excavating at other sites in Greece, like Knossos. But in the late 1880s, more doubters began to aggressively question Schliemann's discoveries and their significance. Importantly, Ernst Bötticher, a former military officer in Germany, published a book purporting to debunk Schliemann's claim that he had discovered Troy. And Bötticher argued that the site was just a necropolis with graves and mausoleums dating to the Assyrian era, long after the supposed Trojan War. Schliemann engaged in a furious pamphlet war with Bötticher, and in 1889 he reopened the site and invited Bötticher and others to come see it, and to explicate the nature and position of the finds. And it seems he basically carried the day, effectively demonstrating that the hill was in fact the site of several Bronze Age cities, and this argument has been widely accepted ever since. Finally, in 1890, as Schliemann was in severely declining health, suffering from chronic, painful ear infections, he went again to Hisarlik and took part in a last excavation. By this time, most of the hill had been excavated as fully as possible, and so they started working outward into areas outside the walls. And these were quite different because the top of the hill had in ancient times been cleared and re-leveled to make way for new building, thus obliterating middle layers of remains. And this had not happened outside of the walls, on the outer plateau and slopes. So here there were layers that had not been found on the top of the hill. And lo and behold, in these new layers, especially the one that they numbered number 6, they found tons of Mycenaean-style pottery, very similar to what had been found in Greece, in sites that seemed to date to Homeric times or very close. And also they found objects in bronze that seemed to fit the styles of the late Bronze Age. So naturally, this began to raise an uncomfortable possibility that in fact the lower level, number 2, that they had been so extensively excavating was actually from long before the Homeric Age and the Trojan War, and that in fact level 6, or something close to it, really represented the city as described in the Iliad. Now this would imply then that the richest finds that they'd uncovered, including so-called Priam's gold and the Jewels of Helen, were not Homeric era at all, but from centuries earlier. And moreover, it implied that Schliemann himself had likely dug right past or through the layer that he had actually been looking for, and that he might have destroyed or lost a great deal of valuable evidence in the process. Now, Schliemann, as it happens, actually acknowledged this as a possibility in a letter that he wrote to the king of Greece. Even though he was reluctant to believe it, he did face that this was a real possibility. Dürrfeld, for his part, was increasingly convinced that this must be the case, that the end of the Bronze Age was layer 6 or 7, as this evidence literally piled up. And according to Dürrfeld's later writings, the task fell to him to break the news to Schliemann, who would certainly not be happy to hear it. And he, in his later writings, wrote, quote, "I discussed the matter with Schliemann, who listened carefully without saying much. He then retired into his own tent and remained incommunicado for 4 days. When he finally came out, he quietly said to me, 'I think you are right.'" End quote. So Schliemann must have already been preparing himself for this possibility, and rather than flying into a rage or firing Dürrfeld or getting into a pamphlet war as he had been wont to do, he instead showed his old resilience and stoicism, and he then threw himself into excavating new material from outside the walls that might come from layer 6 and hence the later Bronze Age. And there he made a final momentous discovery. On July 8th, 1890, when digging around some house foundations outside the walls to the east, a workman uncovered 4 stone ceremonial axe heads made of finely carved and polished lazurite and jadeite. Again, these were of extraordinary quality and finish, probably representing ceremonial implements of authority, and based on the style and location, they undeniably came from the end of the Bronze Age, maybe made in Troy, or perhaps imported from the Black Sea area. Schliemann reportedly was exultant, having finally found objects that could be linked to the time of the Trojan War and the royal court of King Priam. At the end of July, he wrapped up the excavation, traveled back to Paris in order to undergo a painful surgery on his ear. He then wrote an affectionate letter to his wife, calling her, quote, "a good comrade, an unfailing guide, a loving companion, and a mother second to none." On his way back to Greece, on December 26th, he stopped over at a hotel in Naples, where he suddenly collapsed and died. He was 68 years old. So this concluded the career, as I've said, of what people at the time considered one of the great towering personalities of the 19th century. And you can see it was really his obsession and his persistence that led not only to the uncovering of these many layers of Troy, but even just before his death, the identification of a specific layer of Hisarlik as the remains of the Homeric era Troy. Now, excavations did not end here. They continued on, and there would be a longer journey towards firmly proving and interpreting exactly what this find meant and what these excavations really revealed about the nature of Troy as an ancient city. So I'll save that last part after the death of Schliemann on up to the present times for a second section on the interpretation of the discoveries of ancient Troy. So lastly, thank you to Feuerich Piano and to Paul Barton for permission to use his rendition of Rameau's Les Cyclopes. And thank you to my patrons who make this podcast possible. And since we're approaching the month of March, lastly, I'd like to thank my current active patrons who originally signed up in whatever year over the past several years in the month of March. So thank you to Christine Galani, Joseph Murray, Steve Hamlet, Christine Pacheco, Benjamin Newcomb Greusser, Joel Starr Avalos, Kirsten Lamb, Rai Y, John Shea, Michael Greenberg, Christopher Butler, Kevin Martin, Nicholas Blanchard, Louise Ironside, Platon, Elizabeth Herskovitz, Jonas Hachmeister, Chip Mowry, T-Mart, Wilson, Dan, Cole Hammond, Doc, Ewan Patterson, Douglas Uretsky, and Home Theater World. Thank you.